Rain lashed against the uneven dirt road leading into Dustwood Creek, a relentless drum that matched the pounding in Agnes Holloway's chest. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, her soaked skirts clinging to her legs like a second skin. The Widow's Creek mining town she'd once called home had become nothing but echoes of grief and bitter memories. Her husband, Thomas, had died in the mines 6 weeks ago, crushed beneath a collapse that left Agnes with nothing but sorrow and a fragile will to keep moving. Now, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing her few belongings and a hope she barely understood, she trudged through the storm. Her eyes, tired and rimmed with red, scanned the horizon for shelter. The hills of Dustwood Creek rose like jagged teeth in the distance, shrouded in mist. She remembered the story she'd heard in passing, a town where strangers came and went, where survival depended on grit, luck, and a willingness to keep your heart hidden. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the silhouette of a lone homestead at the edge of the woods. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney, a sign of life, of warmth. Agnes's knees gave way, and she fell to her hands and knees in the mud. Her chest heaved with exhaustion. For a moment, she thought of stopping, of letting the storm swallow her, letting the grief have its way. But some stubborn spark within her urged her forward. One more step. One more reach toward whatever awaited beyond that threshold. Rhett Callahan emerged from the cabin as if summoned by the storm itself. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his hair darkened by wind and rain, eyes sharp and assessing beneath heavy brows. His coat, dusted with mud, hung open as he held a lantern in one hand, the warm glow spilling over his rugged face. "You shouldn't be out here in weather like this," he called, his voice carrying over the rain, calm but commanding. Agnes lifted her chin, wet hair plastered to her forehead. "I'm fine," she managed to croak, though her teeth chattered. The lie was weak even to her own ears. Her pride, however, refused to let him see her faltering. "I can manage." Rhett's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger there, only a measured concern that made her bristle all the more. "You look like you've been dragged through a river," he said, setting down the lantern. He knelt, adjusting a hand to steady her as she swayed on unsteady legs. "Come inside. You'll catch your death out here." She pulled away, almost instinctively, her voice sharp. "You'll regret taking me in." Rhett's mouth twitched into something resembling a half-smile, but he didn't step back. "I already regret not doing it sooner," he replied, in a low, steady voice that left no room for argument. The storm seemed to hesitate then, as if even nature itself had paused to listen. Agnes's stomach twisted in disbelief. How could a man be so bold, so unyielding, when her pride and despair were stacked like walls around her? She wanted to retreat, to disappear into the rain and mud, to deny that anyone could know the depths of her sorrow. Yet something in his presence, the unwavering steadiness, the subtle warmth in his gaze, kept her rooted where she stood. Rhett extended his hand again, this time gentler. "You don't have to speak. Just come inside, warm up, eat something." Agnes hesitated, her mind racing. She'd come to Dustwood Creek seeking solitude, not companionship. The thought of sharing space, of exposing herself to another human being after Thomas, it was unbearable. And yet, standing in the rain, shivering to her very bones, she realized she had no other options. Pride battled survival, but the latter won. Finally, with a heavy exhale, she nodded. "Fine. But only until I recover. Then I leave. Understand?" Rhett didn't argue. He simply offered the lantern and motioned toward the cabin. "Understand." As they stepped through the threshold, warmth hit her in waves, heat from the fire, the smell of wood smoke, the faint earthy scent of his home. Agnes shivered, not just from the cold, but from the strange, uncomfortable sense that maybe, just maybe, taking refuge here might change everything. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the land, but inside, Agnes felt the first fragile thread of hope stretching between herself and the man who had defied her warning. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and old leather. Agnes sank into a rough-hewn chair near the fire, wringing her wet hands in her lap. Rhett moved quietly around the room, handing her a towel to dry her hair and offering a bowl of warm stew. The steam curled up to meet her face, carrying the scent of simmered meat and herbs, a smell so ordinary it almost felt foreign after weeks of grief and dust. "I'll just," "Stay for a moment," she muttered, trying to reclaim the control she felt slipping through her fingers. Rhett ignored the protest in her voice. "Sit. Eat. You'll need strength if you're going to stand tomorrow," he said, setting the bowl down in front of her with firm insistence. He had a way of speaking that left no room for argument, yet it wasn't overbearing. It was a quiet, solid authority, the kind that suggested he had lived through storms both literal and personal and come out steadier for it. Agnes picked at the stew, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands. She was wary. She had been warned, after all, about the man whose temper matched the storms of Dustwood Creek. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Rhett Callahan, how he kept to himself, how few had crossed him and lived to tell it, and how some even feared him. Agnes's mind churned with the warnings, but she couldn't ignore the fact that, for the first time in weeks, someone had provided her shelter, food, and an unspoken sense of security. Later that evening, as the wind howled and rain tapped against the cabin walls like tiny fists, Agnes curled herself in a blanket on a narrow cot in the corner. Rhett had lit the hearth with a roaring fire, though he sat at the far end of the room, quietly reading by lantern light. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the crackle of burning logs. It was then that she overheard a fragment of conversation outside. Through the window, voices carried over the rain, a passing rider speaking in low tones to someone in town. Words like Callahan, fearsome, and won't suffer fools reached her ears. Her heart sank. It wasn't just her own pain she carried anymore. The rumors of Rhett's temper, his solitude, painted a picture of a man both admired and avoided, and now she was tangled in his story. Agnes shivered and pulled the blanket tighter. She didn't know what frightened her more, the storm raging outside or the idea of remaining in a house with a man whose reputation made even the boldest in town pause. Her mind, so used to grief, spun with hypothetical dangers. Was she naive to trust him? Could she survive if she stayed? Or was the greater risk giving up her independence and letting someone else, anyone else, see her vulnerability? Rhett noticed her tension and rose, moving toward the fire. He crouched near her, careful not to crowd her space, and spoke softly. "I won't force you. But you're welcome here until you're strong enough to leave. That's all." Agnes looked up at him, her throat tight. "I said, I'll only stay because I have no other choice," she said, the words tasting bitter. Rhett nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Fair enough," he replied, returning to his reading. Yet there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a recognition of pain and pride intertwined. He didn't need to lecture her or coax her compliance. His patience seemed boundless, a steady anchor in her storm-tossed mind. Over the next hours, Agnes allowed herself to drink the stew, to sit by the warmth, and to feel a flicker of something she hadn't dared feel in weeks: rest. It wasn't comfort, not yet. It was merely the brief, trembling pause between storms, a moment to catch her breath before the weight of grief returned. And yet, as the night deepened and the rain continued its unrelenting assault outside, Agnes sensed the first subtle shift. She had arrived at Rhett Callahan's doorstep with the intent of fleeing from the world, from herself, from every human connection. But now, sitting quietly in the firelight, she wondered if survival might mean more than endurance. Perhaps it meant allowing someone, even a man as intimidating and resolute as Rhett, to help her stand. By the time sleep crept over her, Agnes knew one thing with reluctant clarity: she had nowhere else to go. For all her pride and stubbornness, she had accepted a truth she could not deny. She would stay. At least for now. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to take hold, a fragile thread between a grieving widow and a man who refused to let her face the storm alone. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Dustwood Creek slick with mud and shimmering under a weak sun. Agnes stepped outside, boots sinking into the softened earth, and looked at Rhett's homestead. It was modest, a sturdy cabin flanked by a few outbuildings, a fenced pasture, and a small garden, but there was an undeniable sense of order and quiet strength in its design. The place bore the mark of a man who lived by his own rules and who respected the land enough to keep it tamed yet free. Rhett emerged from the cabin carrying a lantern, now emptied of its flame, and a bucket of feed for the horses. His presence was steady, unhurried, and somehow grounding. "You'll need to move around a bit," he said, nodding toward the horses. "Stretch your legs." Help with the chores. You can't heal lying in bed all day. Agnes blinked, taken aback. Chores. She had expected quiet rest, food, maybe a bed, but not labor. I'm not strong enough for that, she protested. Her voice carried both weariness and indignation, but beneath it ran a thread of curiosity she hadn't acknowledged, the possibility that work might heal her in ways she didn't yet understand. Rhett gave her a slow, measured look, one that seemed to peer past her protest and see the stubborn heart beneath. You'll manage, he said simply, handing her a sack of oats. Just follow my lead. Start small. With reluctance, Agnes followed him into the barn. The smell of hay, horse sweat, and the earthy musk of animals filled the space. Her hand shook as she fed the horses, but she noticed something unexpected. Rhett moved beside her without comment, adjusting a halter here, a rope there, and all the while letting her find her own rhythm. He didn't hover, didn't critique, yet his quiet competence was a guide more steady than words could convey. As the day wore on, they mended fences, checked traps, and worked in silence punctuated by occasional instructions from Rhett. Agnes found herself watching him more than she wanted to admit, the way his hands were firm but careful, the way he moved without waste, the rare moments when his gaze softened as he regarded her efforts. Her pride bristled at the subtle stirring of admiration, but she could not ignore the small satisfaction she felt when a fence stood mended or a horse was calmed by her gentle touch. By midday, their shared labor began to foster something new, a rhythm, a tentative understanding. Agnes had expected irritation or judgment, yet Rhett offered none. In that quiet partnership, she discovered a small, surprising relief. The act of work itself was grounding, pulling her out of the endless spiral of grief. During a brief pause, she leaned against the fence, wiping sweat from her brow. I've never worked like this before, she admitted, her voice soft. Rhett glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat before a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes the hardest work is the one that heals you the most, he said. There was no patronizing tone in his voice, only quiet sincerity. Agnes found herself staring at him, searching his face, wondering if he had suffered loss too, if grief had carved similar lines into his own history. As the afternoon sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of amber, Agnes realized she had smiled more than once, albeit faintly, while working. A sensation she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of lightness, of accomplishment, of connection, had crept into her chest. She was wary of its presence, unsure if it belonged or if it was yet another illusion to vanish once the loneliness returned. Rhett, finishing the last of the chores, leaned against the gate, wiping his hands. Not bad for your first day, he said. You're stronger than you think. Agnes bit her lip, uncertain how to respond. Was it gratitude? Surprise? Or something more elusive, something that tugged at her carefully guarded heart? She remained silent, letting the words settle between them, a bridge neither fully crossed but both aware of. As the sun dipped behind the hills, shadows stretched across the homestead, and Agnes felt the first tangible shift in her journey. For the first time since Thomas's death, she recognized the possibility of trust, not complete, not yet, but a small, fragile spark. Rhett's quiet patience, his steady presence, and the simple dignity of shared work had opened a door she hadn't known she was ready to unlock. By evening, the cabin felt less like a refuge forced upon her and more like a place where she might, slowly, begin to mend. And though she would never admit it aloud yet, Agnes Holloway sensed that this stubborn, gruff rancher had begun to chip away at the wall she had built around her heart. Days passed, and Dustwood Creek began to show its quieter rhythm to Agnes. She rose with the sun, joined Rhett in chores, and found a tentative comfort in the routine. The cabin, once cold and alien, now held warmth that went beyond the fire in the hearth. The simple acts of mending fences, feeding horses, and tending the garden allowed her to breathe again, to feel her strength return. And Rhett's presence, steady and unobtrusive, became a silent support she both resisted and appreciated. But the tranquility of routine rarely lasts in a town like Dustwood Creek. One morning, as Agnes walked into the small market to buy supplies, she overheard a conversation that made her stomach knot. A neighboring rancher, gruff and sharp-tongued, spoke in low but deliberate tones to the clerk behind the counter. Callahan's taken in some widow. Word is she's here for his money, thinking she'll land herself a ranch. Agnes froze, heart hammering. The words were casual, yet they carried the weight of accusation. She had not imagined such malice. She had expected solitude, not suspicion. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to remove herself before she caused Rhett harm. He was proud, solitary, and everyone in town respected, or feared, him. What if these rumors reached him, or worse, poisoned his view of her? She hurried back to the homestead, cheeks burning, storming past Rhett as he was fixing the stable door. "Rhett, I think I should leave," she said, words tumbling out in a rush. "People are saying that I'm here for your wealth. I don't want to cause trouble for you." Rhett looked up from the door, his brow furrowed. There was no shock in his gaze, only a quiet assessment. He set his tools aside and walked toward her, closing the distance with a careful, deliberate pace. "Agnes," he said gently, "I don't care what the gossip says. You're staying here. You'll not leave because of lies." Her hands trembled, her pride bristling. "But they'll think you're a fool. They'll say I'm manipulating you." Rhett's eyes softened, and for a moment, the harsh lines of his face seemed to ease. "Let them think what they will. I've known loss, Agnes. I know what it means to be alone and misunderstood. I can see who you are. That's enough for me." For the first time, Agnes saw behind his stoic exterior. A shadow passed over his eyes, one that spoke of a past loss, a grief she could not yet name but felt resonate within her own chest. "You lost someone?" she asked quietly. He nodded, gaze distant. "Years ago. My wife. She didn't make it. Didn't leave me much to hold on to besides work and solitude. I thought I'd always live that way." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Agnes felt a connection she hadn't anticipated, a shared understanding of grief, loss, and the heavy burden of self-reliance. She realized, with a pang of vulnerability, that in this man's steadfastness, she had found something rare, empathy born not of words but of experience. The revelation settled over her as they returned to the homestead together. The farm work continued, but now there was an unspoken camaraderie, a subtle closeness that had not been there before. Agnes laughed softly at a mishap with a stubborn mule. Rhett's deep chuckle followed. The sound seemed to echo across the cleared fields, a promise that even in a town of whispers and suspicion, some truths endured. Yet, amidst the warmth, tension lingered. Agnes could not ignore the rumors that swirled through Dustwood Creek. She knew that the peace they had built was fragile, a delicate structure at risk of being toppled by jealousy or fear. And yet, for the first time, she felt the stirrings of courage, of loyalty to a man who had shown her kindness when the world had shown her none. As dusk fell, casting long shadows over the homestead, Agnes stood by the fence, hands resting on the worn wood. She watched Rhett tend the horses, silent yet precise in his movements. For all the threats and gossip outside their walls, here, at least, she had a place, and perhaps a man she could trust. And that trust, fragile as it was, marked a turning point in her heart. For Agnes Holloway, the road through grief was no longer a solitary journey. It was beginning to intertwine with another's path, a path that might just lead to resilience, understanding, and something she dared not yet name, hope. The days that followed were quieter in some ways, yet Agnes sensed the tension under the calm surface. Dustwood Creek was never truly peaceful. Whispers of rivalries, old grudges, and opportunistic rustlers drifted through the town like the dust kicked up by wagons. Agnes tried to focus on her recovery, on the chores that had become a rhythm, but a creeping unease lingered. One afternoon, as she was checking the fences along the northern pasture, she spotted a flash of movement in the tree line. A horse, unfamiliar, was grazing near the edge of Rhett's land. Her heart quickened. She knew the terrain well enough from her walks, and instinct told her this was no simple wanderer. By the time she returned to the cabin, Rhett was already preparing the rifles, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They're testing the boundaries," he muttered grimly. "Rustlers, most likely. Could be scouting." Agnes swallowed her fear. "What can I do?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. For the first time, she realized her knowledge of the land, of its ridges, hidden paths, and water sources, could actually matter. "I know some paths through the creek that could give us the advantage." Rhett regarded her with a mix of surprise and respect. "Show me," he said. Together, they scouted the perimeter, Agnes pointing out vantage points and possible ambush routes. She felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt since leaving her old home. Every hill, every bend in the creek, every brush pile became a strategic asset. Rhett's usual stern expression softened as he followed her directions, trusting her instincts. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting shadows over the homestead, they worked side by side to set traps along likely approaches. Agnes's hands were calloused from chores, but now they moved with precision born of necessity. Rhett offered guidance, but it was clear he had come to value her input. For the first time, she felt herself more than a guest, more than a grieving widow. She was a partner, a contributor, someone capable of defending not only herself but another life she had grown to respect. Night fell, and the first signs of trouble appeared. Horses whinnied, distant shouts carried over the darkened fields, and Agnes's pulse quickened. The rustlers had returned, testing the traps they had prepared, probing the homestead for weakness. Rhett and Agnes moved quickly, coordinating silently, their earlier unease transformed into a shared purpose. Agnes realized how much trust Rhett had placed in her. His reliance was not only practical but emotional. In that tense moment, she understood that their bond had grown through shared labor, through the sweat and effort of rebuilding fences and tending horses, through the quiet moments of observation and cooperation. The man who had once seemed unyielding now depended on her judgment, and she had never felt so alive. When the rustlers finally retreated into the shadows, Agnes allowed herself a small, relieved laugh. "We did it," she whispered, almost incredulously. Rhett nodded, eyes glinting with a mix of pride and something she could not yet name. "You were incredible. I didn't expect you to be so capable," he admitted. Agnes felt a rush of warmth, mingled with a twinge of embarrassment. She had come here expecting to be weak, to recover, perhaps even to fade into solitude. Instead, she had discovered strength she hadn't known existed. And more than that, she had found that her courage and knowledge could protect someone else, someone she had come to care for in ways she was still unwilling to acknowledge aloud. As they tended the horses and repaired the fences in the dim glow of lantern light, Agnes stole glances at Rhett. He moved with practiced efficiency, but there was a softness in the way he occasionally watched her, a subtle acknowledgement of her contribution. For the first time, she realized that danger and trust were intertwined. By standing together, they had forged a connection stronger than either had anticipated. By the time the cabin fire burned low, Agnes felt a profound sense of belonging. The homestead was no longer just a place of refuge, it was a shared space of resilience, where two people, scarred by loss, could work side by side, face dangers, and discover the quiet strength in one another. For Agnes Holloway, this was more than survival. It was a revelation. Courage was not just the act of facing danger, but the willingness to trust, to participate, and to fight alongside someone who had become unexpectedly important to her heart. Night fell over Dustwood Creek like a heavy, velvet curtain, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. Agnes lay awake on the cot, the events of the day still racing in her mind. The traps they had set and the strategies they had devised seemed sufficient, yet she couldn't shake a growing unease. Her chest tightened as she recalled the shadowy figures in the distance, the way they had tested their defenses. Danger was coming again, and this time, it would not merely be a probing raid, it would demand courage, action, and resolve she wasn't sure she possessed. The first warning came as a faint rustling outside the cabin, followed by the distant whinny of an alarmed horse. Agnes leapt from the bed, heart pounding. Rhett emerged from his room, rifle in hand, eyes dark and determined. "They are back," he muttered. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say." Agnes swallowed hard but nodded. Fear curled through her, yet alongside it was a sharp, determined edge. She had trained, learned the terrain, and understood the patterns of the land. She would not cower. Not now. Not after everything she had faced to get this far. The rustlers came under cover of night, moving silently toward the homestead. Rhett led Agnes through the shadows, past the stables, and along the creek, whispering instructions. Their traps slowed the intruders, but one rustler slipped past, lunging toward Rhett with a knife glinting in the dim lantern light. In the struggle, Rhett was overpowered and dragged toward the tree line, shouts echoing across the darkened fields. Agnes froze for a heartbeat, terror clawing at her chest. Rhett's hand was barely free as he struggled against the grip of the rustler, and in that moment, something inside her snapped. All the lessons of the past days, all the chores, all the trust and teamwork, they boiled down to a single truth. She would not allow this man to be taken, not when she had a role to play, not when she had found courage she didn't know she had. She ran toward the nearest rancher's house, pounding on the door, shouting for help. The neighbors, roused from sleep, grabbed rifles and lanterns, rallying under her direction. Agnes led them along the creek paths she had memorized, guiding them silently and efficiently to intercept the rustlers. The night air was thick with tension, the sounds of shouting and galloping horses mingling with the distant storm clouds rumbling over the hills. Rhett, freed from the rustler's grasp by the combined efforts of Agnes and the townsfolk, stumbled but quickly regained his footing. His gaze met hers, wide with a mixture of relief, pride, and something deeper she could not name. She had saved him, not just through instinct, but through skill, foresight, and courage. The realization hit her in waves. She was not merely a bystander in this story. She was a participant, a partner, a force capable of facing fear head-on. When the last rustler was driven off into the darkness, silence settled over the homestead. The neighbors retreated, murmuring congratulations and warnings, leaving Agnes and Rhett alone amid the wreckage of overturned barrels and trampled grass. Rhett approached her slowly, his hand steady but his eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. "You," he began, but stopped, searching for words. "You were incredible," he said finally, voice low and almost trembling. I don't know if I would have made it without you." Agnes shook, not from fear this time, but from the raw surge of adrenaline and relief. I couldn't let them take you," she whispered. The words surprised even her, carrying an honesty that startled her own heart. Rhett reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, steadying both her and himself. "You've changed things, Agnes. You've changed me," he said quietly. For a long moment, they stood together, breathing in the crisp night air. The danger had passed, but the intensity of the shared experience lingered like fire in their veins. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a testament to their courage and trust. Agnes, who had arrived seeking only solitude, had discovered a new strength, and a bond with a man who had become more than a stranger, more than a companion. He was a presence she could rely on, a soul she could trust, and perhaps, in time, someone she could love. For the first time since the loss of her husband, Agnes felt something unfamiliar. Hope entwined with courage, resilience forged in fire, and a realization that opening her door, and her heart, could lead to a life worth fighting for. The night was thick with tension, the homestead eerily quiet after the chaos of the previous encounter. Agnes sat by the dying embers of the fire, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline that refused to leave her veins. Outside, shadows shifted among the trees, and she knew, deep in her bones, that the rustlers were not finished. They would return, perhaps more determined, more ruthless. And this time, she understood, there would be no safety in waiting. Rhett, sitting across from her, cleaned his rifle with methodical calm. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of unease, the kind that only comes when one recognizes true danger. "They'll be back," he murmured. "We have to be ready." Agnes nodded, determination hardening her features. Fear was still there, sharp and raw, but it no longer paralyzed her. She had seen what she was capable of, how her knowledge, courage, and resolve could matter in the face of real threat. Tonight, she would not merely defend herself. She would protect the man who had become her anchor and their shared home. Hours later, the rustlers emerged from the darkness, moving with caution but relentless intent. Agnes and Rhett had laid traps and scouted the terrain, turning every hill and dip into a strategic advantage. As the first rustler came into sight, Agnes stepped out from her hidden position, her voice strong and commanding. "Stop! You'll get no further." A tense standoff followed, punctuated by whispers, shifting feet, and the glint of knives and rifles under the dim moonlight. The leader of the rustlers stepped forward, sneering, confident in his numbers and the chaos of the night. Agnes's gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "Let him go," she demanded, her voice trembling just slightly, carrying the weight of authority born from necessity. Rhett emerged beside her, his presence steady and grounding. You'll leave now, or you'll answer to both of us, he added, calm but lethal in tone. Together, they formed a united front, two forces whose bond was more than strategy. It was trust, loyalty, and shared courage. The leader laughed, dismissive, but Agnes noticed the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. She pressed on, speaking quickly and clearly, leveraging the knowledge of the land, the traps, and the support of the few allies who had gathered unseen. Her words were more than threats, they were a promise. She had faced fear and survived, and she was willing to fight to the last for the man beside her. Finally, the rustler leader paused, calculating. Agnes sensed the moment was theirs. She took a careful step forward, eyes locked on his, and laid out the terms: release Rhett and leave, or risk being caught and exposed. The knight seemed to hold its breath as he weighed her words. Slowly, deliberately, he signaled his men to retreat, the threat dissolving under the weight of courage, cunning, and unity. Rhett stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, a mix of gratitude and awe in his eyes. You were incredible, he said, voice low but sincere. I've never seen anyone handle themselves like that. Agnes shook, a laugh escaping her lips, a mix of relief, disbelief, and something more profound, something that had been growing quietly in her heart. I couldn't let them take you, she whispered, echoing the truth she had felt in the heat of danger. Rhett's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You've changed everything, Agnes. More than you know, he murmured. His eyes, dark and steady, held a vulnerability that only she had ever glimpsed. I already regret not taking you in sooner. The words, simple yet weighted with meaning, struck her. Here was a man who had once seemed untouchable, gruff, solitary, now transformed, softened by trust, courage, and the quiet intimacy of shared labor and peril. She felt the walls around her own heart give way, brick by brick, as a warmth she had long denied herself began to spread. Together, they surveyed the aftermath, the quiet nights settling around the homestead once more. Their shared victory was not just over the rustlers, it was over fear, grief, and the isolation that had defined them both. The bond forged in sweat, determination, and courage had solidified, a promise unspoken yet undeniable. For Agnes Holloway and Rhett Callahan, the night marked not only survival but transformation. In facing danger together, they had discovered the courage to trust, to rely on one another, and to open themselves to the possibility of love. And as the first faint light of dawn touched the horizon, hope, fragile and bright, began to rise over Dustwood Creek. Morning arrived with a gentle light, soft and forgiving after the turmoil of the night. Dustwood Creek was quiet, the homestead bathed in golden sun that made the damp earth glisten like scattered jewels. Agnes stood at the edge of the garden, hands resting on the wooden fence, watching Rhett tend the horses. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke, a promise of a day that held both labor and possibility. The events of the previous night still lingered in her mind, sharp and vivid, but now they were tempered by relief and a strange sense of accomplishment. She had faced fear, confronted danger, and, most unexpectedly, discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. But more than that, she had learned something deeper. Trust and courage, when shared, could transform not only survival but life itself. Rhett's voice broke her reverie. "Breakfast'll be ready soon," he said, leaning against the stable door, arms crossed. His usual gruffness softened in the early light, the edge of exhaustion tempered by calm. "You've earned a bit of rest before we start chores again." Agnes smiled faintly, a warmth rising in her chest she could no longer deny. She had arrived at this homestead as a weary, grieving widow, expecting solitude and maybe temporary refuge. Instead, she had found a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and courage. And beneath it all, a quiet, undeniable bond was taking root, one that neither of them could ignore. Inside the cabin, the scent of fresh bread and frying bacon filled the air. Agnes moved with a new ease, setting the table with plates and utensils, the simple act of preparing breakfast feeling less like a task and more like a continuation of the life she was learning to embrace again. Rhett joined her, leaning casually against the doorway, watching her work with a mixture of amusement and admiration. "You've settled in well," he remarked, voice low but teasing. "Hardly the same stubborn woman who arrived in the rain." Agnes laughed softly, a sound that carried relief, warmth, and the faint thrill of connection. "Some stubbornness remains," she replied, "but it's easier to be stubborn when you know someone has your back." Rhett's smile deepened, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. No words were needed to acknowledge what had been forged through shared danger, long days of labor, and nights of unspoken grief. Their bond was stronger than mere companionship. It was trust, loyalty, and the beginnings of something neither had expected to find again. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly beside them. Outside, the homestead was alive with the simple rhythm of work, horses neighing, chickens clucking, and the occasional call from a distant neighbor tending their own land. Life, once a tenuous thread for Agnes, now felt tangible and within reach. After breakfast, Rhett stepped outside and watched Agnes prepare the garden tools for the day. He leaned against the doorway, eyes softening as he murmured, "I already regret not taking you in sooner." Agnes paused, a tender smile spreading across her face. She had resisted, doubted, and feared opening herself to another after the loss of her husband. Yet here she stood, heart lightened by courage, companionship, and a growing affection that had quietly taken hold. The words weren't boastful or loud. They were a simple truth, a recognition of the impact they had made on each other. She approached him, hand brushing against his as they both reached for the same tool. The gesture was small, intimate, yet spoke volumes. "Maybe, it wasn't just me who needed saving," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft certainty of someone who had learned the value of trust and shared strength. Rhett's eyes met hers, dark and steady, reflecting gratitude, admiration, and a warmth that had been absent from both their lives for too long. Together, they stepped into the day, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges the frontier might bring, strengthened by the bond forged through hardship and courage. For Agnes Holloway and Rhett Callahan, the homestead was more than a place of survival. It was a home built on resilience, mutual respect, and love that had grown from the trials they had endured. As the sun climbed higher, painting the land in gold, a quiet peace settled over them. The storms had passed, both literal and emotional, leaving behind the promise of a future they would shape together, hand in hand, heart to heart. If you enjoyed Agnes and Rhett's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss more Wild West tales of courage and love.